Hello and welcome to the Premier Injuries channel. Today we're talking about a very important topic. Not going to sugarcoat it. It's a topic that really is affecting all sport, and we're going to discuss it with an expert, Judith McMinn from Rezon. There's so many things that we can say about you, Judith. You've done so much already, but I want to start off with actually one of your fantastic phrases, and this will introduce what we're talking about today. You asked the question, why do people protect their shins but not their brain? So we're talking all about head injuries today. And Judith, why is this such an important topic?
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to come talk about brain injury. Sport has introduced into its language, its lexicon, and its reporting head impacts. But really, it's brain injury. And the skull is repairable, but the brain is not. You cannot come back from an injury, a brain injury, stronger. The brain is our most vulnerable and our most important part of our body. It determines our moods, our thinking, our processing. It's who we are. And it defines and determines performance in sport and in life. And while sport has focused particularly on below the neck, so being faster and fitter and stronger, it has for the most part neglected the brain. And the closest it's really come to that is really around nutrition and sleep. So we're deciding to really challenge this notion of what makes performance in sport and really look to reduce brain injury happening in sport and wider than just football, and in elite and professional and amateur, across women, children, youth game, etc. Brain injury is a real injury and a real risk for everyone who plays sport.
And, just before we get into the facts and everything, I think this is a story that will affect and ring true with many people, but this is something that has affected you personally twice. When you were young, you witnessed a terrible brain injury in hockey, and then later on, sadly, you lost your father to, something that is related to brain injury, dementia. So do you want to talk us through that experience as well, maybe how that has shaped your research?
Yeah, so I many people played school sports, and the lower the level of the skill in sport, the higher the risk of injury. And what seemingly was a very, at the time, looked like a very simple impact to the head with a ball coming up in hockey went on to change the course of somebody's life. And I've told that story, many, many times for people to come and speak to me afterwards and say, well, yeah, that happened to my friend too. And this, this idea that, people are not impacted at very, very amateur levels in sport by, a kick to the head or an elbow to the head or a ball to the head is simply not true. Brain injury is much, much more prevalent than any data sets that we have. And then dementia. Dementia is a major issue. I mean, in 2020, more women died of dementia than COVID. And dementia has, something that impacts, I think, pretty much every family. They know someone either directly or indirectly who's been, has suffered with it or is suffering with it. And it's life-changing. And obviously, with the understanding of CTE in sport and the appreciation of that condition, there's been a little bit of confusion around that early onset dementia and the dementia that we probably understand as a society. But, dementia is life-changing, and it's life-changing for the individual, their family, and their friends. And I think behind, everybody has a personal experience that shapes something in their life or makes them want to ask a question. And the question I've been asking for 25 plus years is, why do we protect our shins or our teeth in some other sports and not our brain? Because we need our brain long after we've hung up the boots or the stick or the given in the ball. And nobody's ever been able to give me that answer. And we spend huge amounts of money on equipment for knees and elbows and, all sorts of treatments and physio afterwards. But there was nothing on the market when I started looking into this that was around protecting the brain. There was plenty to protect the skull, but protecting the skull and protecting the brain are two different things, and it's brain protection rather than skull protection that you need in sport.
Hi, Judith. Thanks for joining us today. It's an absolute pleasure. We've spoke on several occasions, and a question that keeps on sort of cropping up in my own mind is, you are currently working with elite level clubs, the Premier League, Rugby 15s, the WSL, the AFL, second tier of English football. And at an elite level, there is an awareness of these concussive and subconcussive hits. But in terms of filtering that down to grassroots level, like you say, that just doesn't seem to be happening. That people are not educated, people are either misinformed or ill-informed or are not aware of it at all. Why do you think that, while it is known at the highest level, by those relative associations and federations, why do you think that message given, the potential sort of cognitive impact and degeneration over long-term abuse of the brain, why do you think that's not filtering down, and why isn't somebody proactively going out there to ensure that people are protected when they're out there playing or participating in a sport they love or an activity that they enjoy?
It's an uncomfortable truth. It's a commercial truth. So some sports are obviously quite concerned around brain injury. I think rugby's probably shown its example of that. There was, some earlier news in the week about, concerns at school level of parents not wanting children to be playing rugby. And that's also been the case in some of the studies around football, where parents have been concerned around children heading. And you've seen the governing bodies take interim action to try and quell that concern by limiting heading, or by reducing the height of a tackle, or limiting contract time, so that you're reducing that. But at the very sort of amateur level clubs, the truth of the matter is a lot of people are volunteers. They put lots of time into this, but they haven't had the resources, they haven't had the insights to allow them probably to make informed decisions, and to be aware of all the facts. So that's one of the big challenges with us, and when we're bringing out our product to market, is actually not that we're bringing out a product that's a better version of something that's out there. We're bringing out a new product that sadly people don't know they yet need, because they don't know how big this problem is, or indeed the risk that they're exposed to. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is there's not one person, one high profile sports person in whatever sport, talking about brain injury. So we've got sports people talking about every other issue in our society, but there's not one person talking about brain injury. And it's back to that point. Sport thinks about performance below the neck. Sport thinks that performance is below the neck. And until possibly one high profile sports person, comes out and speaks about protecting their performance through, reducing their brain injury risk through impacts or in whatever game, and that's possibly when it will ripple through to the amateur game. And fans and parents and coaches all have a role in educating themselves and educating others. And also, I think in light of the court action that's happening, and former players who are taking governing bodies to task over not having protected them in the past, I do also think that will bring in changes around insurance, and changes around health and safety, where people will be asked to just rethink and reconsider what are the risks here. But it's just a mixture of things, and truthfully, there's just not enough debate, informed, accurate debate. Where the debates have happened, they're focused on the wrong things, and typically the same voices talking about the same things, as opposed to a much more informed and balanced debate.
And just on that issue then of informed debate, kind of maybe almost correcting the record, because you have done the research. I think one of the big things that we did when we've been discussing with you, liaising and also reading your research, is understanding maybe the difference between concussion and subconcussive hits which aren't discussed at all, that aren't brought up in these discussions. And arguably, in terms of CTE or chronic traumatic
encephalopathy, it's very hard to say.
Encephalopathy, it's a very hard word to say, as you said there. It's these aren't discussed, even though it's arguably the bigger cause of such a terrible degenerative disease.
Yeah, so concussion is probably something that's coming into the lexicon. I mean, obviously there are concussion guidelines. Most people probably know the term concussion. Can they explain it? Do they know all the symptoms of it? Probably not, but they have a broad understanding. There are some myths around it. So people think that concussion is a loss of consciousness. It's not. Less than 10% of concussions ever result in a loss of consciousness. People think concussion is immediate, when in fact 80% of concussions present over the following 24 hours. But subconcussions are essentially concussions that you're not even aware of. So it's a lesser force. So a concussion is 2 to 4 times the force of a subconcussion. And subconcussions also cause damage to the brain. But the problem with subconcussions is that you don't realize you're getting them. So it's the accumulation of them and concussions. But you can get so many subconcussions without even realizing it's happening. And no one around you realizes it's happening either. And for every concussion, it's estimated you've probably had 500 subconcussions. And the problem with CTE is that 20% of people who've been diagnosed with CTE and death never, ever recorded a concussion in their life. So by focusing on concussion, you are not educating people around subconcussion, and you're not bringing it back to the cumulative effect of brain injuries, whether they are concussion or subconcussions. And I think concussion shouldn't be talked about in isolation. It needs to be understood as concussion and subconcussions, and it needs to be understood in terms of the frequency, not just the symptoms, and it needs to be understood in terms of what is that damage doing to the brain, because that's what a concussion is. It's a brain injury. And I think when people understand that and use that term interchangeably instead of a concussion or a subconcussion, I think that's back to that point. I think that will filter down very quickly to raise people's awareness and understanding.
And just on this issue then, this is why we've got you on today. Your company, Rezon, has created headgear to kind of tackle this. Now, one of the things that is different between any other headgear, and this is why, as you have explained, this is the only one on the market that does this. Your headgear protects from rotational impacts as well, which are, maybe you can explain better. Are they worse? Are they more dangerous than the traditional kind of people thinking, oh, a bonk on the head and that's it? I mean, can you talk us through what your headgear does that no others can do?
Yeah, so when you take an impact to the head, there are 2 types of forces involved. There's a linear force, which is essentially a straight line force. So that's like someone hitting you in the face, straight on. It's like a ball coming from the heavens right down to the top of your head. And linear forces stretch and compress the brain. And the brain is like jelly-like, meat-like inside the skull. And it stretches and it squashes. But a rotational force comes from an angled impact. So rotational forces come from angled hits, which are really what happen in sport. It's very rare you get a straight-on hit in sport. What you'll get is an angled knee, an angled elbow, an angled ball. And that causes the brain to rotate inside the skull. And when the brain rotates inside the skull, it causes the brain cells to shear, to be torn, and damage to the blood vessels in that. And it causes an inflammatory reaction inside the brain. And when that happens repeatedly, damage is caused. And so rotational forces are key. So anytime anybody puts anything on their brain, on their head to protect them, the question they need to ask is, what's the rotational force reduction? Because it's not the linear forces that are the damage, it's the rotational forces. And that's where we have focused in reducing specifically the rotational forces. And we developed technology called rotection, protection against rotational forces. And that technology is designed to reduce rotational forces by up to 61% based on independent testing. And we've put that inside a sports headband. And the headband is designed to cover where 80% of impacts happen in sport. And that's right across sports. And essentially, when you take either a direct or an angled hit to the head, usually in the area where the headband covers, there are 9 layers inside the headband, and those layers move over each other to reduce the transmission of those rotational forces so that there is less of that rotational force going from the skull to the brain. And therefore that reduces then the risk of that one-hit concussion, but more importantly, reducing these small, unknown, unseen subconcussions, which cumulatively do damage. And you're right, we're in the business of brain protection, not skull protection. And there are products which have been developed in the US which focus on linear forces. There are arguably scrum caps that have focused on linear forces. They are good for cuts and abrasions, but they are not effective brain protection. And the more we understand about the brain and the more we understand about the risk of brain injury in sport, the more there is the need for effective brain protection. And helmets don't protect the brain. Helmets, as in American football helmets or motorbike helmets, are designed to stop linear forces, and they work well for linear forces. But the problem is that they allow more rotational forces to be submitted to the brain, because what they're doing is they are stopping the skull being damaged, but they're doing nothing to protect the brain. And that's one of probably the misconceptions that people have about helmets. And one of the comments that a lot of people say, well, if sport is worried about head injury, why don't people wear helmets? Well, that's the answer why they don't wear helmets, because helmets wouldn't work. Helmets work, as I say, pretty well for linear forces, but they allow arguably bigger hits to be transmitted to the brain. And brain injury is actually the root problem in all of this.
And Judith, do you think it's that lack of understanding and almost that media agenda that's Dawn Astle, the late daughter of Jet Astle, since when he passed away in 2002, and subsequent Alan Shearer, they're championing the cause and pushing agenda with regards to dementia and this particular program about reducing heading the ball. Does that muddy the waters in terms of a message it's sending out and saying, well, actually, it's only those that head the ball maybe are liable to or potentially suffer concussive or subconcussive hits, and everything else is almost just either pushed to one side or forgotten about or just, not even considered?
The debate around brain injury in sport is very confused. It's confused that it's a debate around heading in football. But as we know, head to ball impacts in football are 13%. So the equivalent debate would be saying that a certain chocolate bar causes obesity in this country, and if you stop the sale of that, you wouldn't have obesity, when we know that actually the root cause is sugar. And the root cause in sport, in the same point, is not heading, it's rotational impacts that cause concussion and subconcussive injury. The second thing is that it's become a very much a debate around professional sport, and actually there's a real risk for everybody, and that's got lost. It's also got conflated in this idea that it's a problem of the past, because people have confused it with old leather footballs, and a lot of the data sets have looked at players in the 70s, when in fact FIFA have known about brain injury since 1984 and earlier in some of the articles that they've produced. So there's a lot in this debate that needs corrected, and people need to understand it's about reducing rotational forces to the brain. It's more than just concussions. It's concussions and subconcussions. It's for everybody, not just professionals. And also that there are people at a greater risk. And by that, we mean women, we mean children, and we mean those who've had a previous brain injury, so those with a previous concussion. And until all of these facts are set out and people have the opportunity to understand them and to sort of impact assess them against their own situation or their club or their child's situation, I think this is going to take some time for people to decipher what has become really a very crowded and a very confused debate. And some of the experts who've been speaking on this haven't done a great job in setting out the facts. The media haven't helped in sort of decoupling and detangling some of the confusion. And I think it's going to just take a little bit of time for people to get back to what are the real basics, and then make their own decision. And this is, at the end of the day, is a decision. It's a decision back to that question, why do you protect your shins and not your brain? Well, some people may just choose that they don't wish to protect their brain. And they can choose that in the same way that some people choose, even in sports where a mouthguard is pretty good sense, still don't wear a mouthguard. And maybe it will take some rule changes at certain levels for people to think about why they would want to protect their brain. And particularly for children, it's very hard to understand why, somebody of an age would consent, or their parents or their guardians or their coaches would consent to increase their risk of neurodegenerative disease. So this is it's a thorny issue. It's an issue where there's a lot that needs to be better explained, and importantly said in forums where people can come back to the facts.
And just on this issue as well, you've explained a little bit that it affects women more, but can you just open out this issue before we get on to children as well, why it's so important to protect them?
So for women, brain cells are longer and thinner, so they shear more easily. Hormonally, so menstrual cycles play a part in this. Neck strength is also thought to play a part in it. So a woman has a neck with about a 30% less girth than a man, so neck strength something. Training and issue management. Those are all factors that play a part in this. But one of the things that's really significant is we do not have the same data sets. So a lot of the thinking and a lot of the science is really based around male athletes as opposed to female. And that's one of the big pushes and big focuses, is to understand brain injury in women. But I think it's fair to say that, we have seen, and thankfully so, a real increase in the participation of women's sport at all levels. And, the Euros is a great example of that, where people are getting behind the national side. And there are 500,000 more women doing sport each week than there was a generation ago. Now, not all of that will be sports that run the risk of brain injury. But what does the future hold? Because most of the growth around sport is in the women's game. And as we look to see rugby and other sports becoming more professional, and the women emulating the training regimes that the men have done in being faster and fitter and stronger and bulking up, what does the future hold for that, given that we know women are at a greater risk? And again, there's been really no real interest from women in the game to understand that. Coaches not interested because they want to follow the path that male coaches and male teams have followed. And yet it's not like for like. And I think it was interesting to watch the Norwegian and England team play, and the Norwegian goalkeeper was wearing a protective headband, not ours, I should say, but was wearing a protective headband. And no one even asked why she was wearing it. It didn't make any comment. And clearly the Norwegian goalkeeper had a lot to do in that game, so she had a lot of air coverage. And I think when the England team realised that their performance and their mental agility and their strength comes from their brain rather than their hamstrings, I wonder if they'll also think maybe they should be wearing something to protect their brain and, more importantly, protect their performance in that tournament as well.
And I'm sure, Ben, you've got questions as a father about how it affects children.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a previous conversation, Judith, and I was shocked and taken aback at a statistic that when you spoke about, because I've got two young boys, very active, very keen footballers, boxing probably most of the time when I'm not looking. And, between those ages of 8 and 12 and its peak development of the brain, if your child suffers brain trauma, significant impact in those years, then they will be cognitively impaired compared to peers of their age. And I was actually just blown away by that. And the reality sort of sets in that, you need to be protecting your young people if you want them to go out and be active and remain healthy and have a long, healthy, successful quality of life. Then it's not even a question to be asked. It's something that just needs to be done.
And the US leads the way in sort of understanding this research around brain injury, and particularly in youth players. But you're right, a child that takes an impact, a head impact, under the age of 12, grows up to be cognitively disadvantaged than the child who was older than 12 when they took that impact. And that's quite significant. And with that is also the significance that one season of sport, one season of contact sport is enough to cause structural brain injury. So you think about the numbers of players under 12 playing football, rugby, hockey, tag rugby, that could happen to. And you think about any other instance that a parent or a guardian would allow a child to grow up cognitively disadvantaged. It just doesn't happen. And yet that fact is not known. And it's maybe some of the thinking that's gone into some of the guidelines, particularly around football, where they've used the age 12 as sort of the benchmark, the line in the sand. But I think when you add that together and you realize that peak development of the brain, and the brain goes on to develop not just beyond the age of 12, but a process called myelination, which essentially is allowing the protective coating around brain cells called myelin. That continues until your early 20s. So even our academy players, even our youth players are still at risk. So it's scary. And again, it's part of this awareness and this understanding that needs to come around brain injury. And it's just crazy that, we push our bodies to the limit in sport, but we're doing it below the neck. And that's the bit that comes back.
Yeah, and for me, there's almost, and I know you've been more successful in pushing the Rezon product into clubs and academies rather than others. And why do you think that is? Why do you think there's a reluctance, certainly in that of academy, that youth and development age, to protect the players? Isn't this a question of, is it not a requirement of a PPE? Actually going out and doing your job, then the expectation, there's a care of duty.
Yeah, I mean, it's just unbelievable that people don't think about it as that sort of the duty of care. Yeah. They don't think about player welfare. I mean, what we find is that the older the player, the more they think, well, I'm fine. I've gone this far, I'm fine. Peer pressure kicks in to some degree as well. So again, it's back to these points that people don't know the facts, and when they do, they're quite shocked. Do they make changes? Some do, some don't. But what we're starting to see is that when people realize that you can lose your place on the team because of concussion and subconcussion, more and more, we've seen that particularly in the England tour to Australia, at a very professional level, where you understand as well that for commercial teams, losing people has a financial impact, and you guys know more about that analysis than anyone else. But also, when you realize that if you've had a concussion and for a year afterwards, your risk of a lower body injury, so knee, ankle, muscle strains, is up to 67% higher, you're probably then starting to appreciate that actually, there really is, back to that point, a pretty good reason to be protecting the brain. But yeah, it's very hard for people to probably digest this. It's really uncomfortable. So people don't want to have the conversations. It's culturally just challenging, and it's particularly challenging for coaches and clubs that have always done it a particular way. This seems a very hard pill for them to swallow, that actually there is this risk. And there's a macho culture in some sports and in some clubs. And I've presented to clubs where, parents have sat in the room and said, "And a lot happened to my child." Statistically, it will.
And I just want to bring it on to maybe a few examples then. Ben and I, obviously with our day-to-day work, we're always looking at football, the Premier League, but even onto the international scene as well. And I think one of the big ones that maybe started some of the discussions or at least progressed it a little bit further was Raul Jimenez. But I think this is maybe another example of what you have discussed, Judith, of an extreme example, but where subconcussion has not been kind of brought in at all, because obviously there was the real tragedy and the shocking fact that he was knocked out and he had a skull injury. But as you said a little bit previously, you can repair a skull, but you can't repair that damage to his brain. And now he's going out there each week, week in, week out. He's wearing a headgear, and Ben can actually explain a little bit on that in terms of his headgear doesn't even conform to the rules. It's not actually supposed to be allowed. But in terms of it, he's putting his life at risk. And the discussions aren't about this subconcussion problem, and the proper headgear is not being brought in or even discussed.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously he had that very shocking injury, which took him out for a period of time. You're right, he's wearing a piece of headgear that's illegal in this country to sell because it's not CE compliant. But you're right, he's putting himself at risk, not just from another concussion, but the numerous subconcussions that he will be taking. And it's back to this cumulative dose. So, you know, we don't know the threshold of how much is too much. It's more the case of how little is too much. So he's really pushing the limit for what his brain can take. And he's just one player that has this, but it's all the other players that maybe didn't have such a horrific visual injury, but all the subconcussions that they're picking up, and they too are having this cumulative dose around what it is. But and I think one of the things that's been quite interesting is, you know, people now see perhaps protective headwear, and his is headwear, not brain protection, as an after the event. And sports attitude has been after the event around concussion and subconcussion. So it's been around measuring it and managing it. But why would you measure and manage it and not reduce it? And that's a question that I'm still staggered by when I meet people and they say, well, we'll deal with it afterwards. Or we're investing in instrumented mouthguards, which are regular mouthguards, but with microchips in them to show essentially the head impact, the force that the head has taken. It's taken as a proxy through the jaw. But that's all after the event has happened. It's all after you've suffered a concussion or a subconcussion. And, you know, I'm surprised that, you know, Jimenez perhaps hasn't quite, maybe, again, probably culturally difficult for him in the position he's in the team he's in, maybe to talk about this. But really, the headgear is, you know, it's a bit late now. You know, if anything, the rest of the team wearing it with him would have been the smarter move than opposed to just him, because everybody else is at the same risk he was, you know, 2-3 years ago before his significant head injury.
And it's the wrong type of headgear as well. It's not for, as you say, rotational kind of impacts.
Yeah, it's much more focused around reducing linear forces. So the particular product, their claim is that they reduce linear forces by 50%. It doesn't matter if they reduce it by 99.9%, it's irrelevant. It's back to reducing rotational forces to the brain. Sadly, that level of debate doesn't even happen because, as again, you know, people don't know the difference between linear and rotational forces. I always say to people this, you know, if you're not putting something on your head that reduces rotational forces to your brain, then you might as well be wearing a hairnet or a shower cap. And some people laugh at that, but it's a very honest truth. That's again back to the point about why we focused on our product and on rotational forces and giving everybody the choice, but ideally getting them to wear the product pre concussion and subconcussions, because as I say, afterwards then you're just measuring and managing, and that's not really the solution in all of this.
And what
sorry, Jason. I was just going to follow up, and you know, given the nature of the sport, you know, is that something that you would ever foresee changing without an intervention from the relevant sporting authorities to changing protocol and regulations to state, you know, that you must wear this? Certainly at grassroots level, we're seeing headgear become more and more commonplace. But I almost think it's not maybe off the likes of your Raul Jimenez in your headgear, or even your Peter Cechs prior to that. It's almost seen as a little bit of a cool fashion accessory with the likes of your Alan San Maxims going out there and having, either patterned and multicolored. And it's very similar concept to what sort of your Rezon headbands are hoping to adopt as well, and make it more appealing. Do you think, does it require more than that to try and allow people to buy in and get the product? Is it almost, we know what it does in terms of that rotational force, but it's still got to look cool?
Yeah, and that's been a very hard balance to find something that's functionally, good and effective, along with, in line and matching with kit and the general appearance that people want. I mean, everybody wants to wear something that makes them look better and is enviable product in itself. In terms of time for change to happen, I mean, the way I think about it is like this. 30 years ago, people didn't buy or didn't go out and buy sun lotion. They were probably slightly unaware of the risks around sun damage. And now, you just don't go in and buy sun lotion. You buy a factor according to your risk. That's taken a generation to filter through. The same with seat belts in cars. And for people to understand the risk. And I think we're on that journey around brain protection in sport. I think the things that accelerate that are firstly, insurance. So when players can't get insurance anymore for brain injury, then you're going to look about doing something to protect yourself. When clubs and governing bodies feel the financial pain of paying out, which again, as we've seen in the media, is already started in this country, then they're going to think, well, how do we reduce our risk? And then the last big change comes from people understanding their own personal risk and actually what they can do to help themselves and becoming informed from that. But it's not going to happen overnight. And we have obviously developed something that we think is a very smart thing to be wearing on the pitch and in training, that is effective, is as stylish as we've sought to make it, and continue to evolve it to match sort of player preferences and styles. But the thing that needs to change is at a parent, player, fan, and club level is understanding that brain injury is a real risk, no matter who you are in what sport, and really to reduce it rather than measure it and manage it afterwards is the smarter thing. And hopefully when that starts to be understood and we see more and more people, then it will be essentially everybody starting to do that. And like shin guards, obviously they were mandated, but if you think about football boots, football boots were black, and then some guy came out with white boots, and then all of a sudden it started this whole sort of trend around that. And I think, as fickle as that sounds, I think we might have to be waiting on that journey as well for people to catch on that things happen. But certainly, from the medics and the people who really understand this, I mean, they're just horrified at the lack of understanding. And I think the media, and having the opportunity to be on your podcast today, talk about this and set out the real facts is really helpful, because, as I say, a lot of things in the media do become quite confused and cluttered and very focused around one topic: heading, football, rugby tackles, when in fact you need to put a lot of data points together to have an understanding of what this issue is, and more importantly, how to seek to mitigate it.
I think as well, we're talking about accessibility here, and sometimes people see price as an ability to kind of get these products, and some things in football are priced out of the average person, especially with medicine and things like that. But with your product, it's actually interesting. It's at a price point that, first of all, people should consider buying just for their health, but it is very affordable, isn't it?
Well, we hope so. I mean, of course, you never can get a price that suits everybody. I mean, there are still people who suck air through their teeth, and would still suck their air through the teeth if it was a £5. We've made something that's $173 a week. We expect the band to last a season on regular usage, wearing it a couple of times a week. If you're wearing it longer than that, obviously, like everything, it has a shorter shelf life. This product was not designed as much as it's needed for Harry Kane to wear it as anybody else, it was designed for the Harry on the regular club who, wouldn't miss the price of half a latte or, a cheeseburger in McDonald's. That was the price point that we sought to, and particularly for kids, particularly for schools, particularly for clubs. When you put it into club subs and things like that, you shouldn't miss it. But again, it comes back to the question: what price do you value your performance in sport, in life? And given there's no brain transplant available, and that's it, then what price do you put on your brain? And some of the shocking things that I've had said to me is one rugby club, where the women said to me they didn't care if they got dementia. And that comment hit me pretty hard on a personal level. But actually, I was quite shocked, because actually that came from just a lack of understanding, a lack of probably an appreciation of what they could lose and would lose if they were to go on to suffer dementia, and particularly if it was sort of influenced by the fact that they'd taken head injuries, head impacts, and subsequently, brain injury and brain damage from a sport that they really enjoyed. And I think in time, those comments won't be said anymore, because people will connect head impact to brain injury to future risk in sport, and, choose to buy something that reduces that risk. And perhaps the games will change as well further to reduce that risk as well. But that's probably where we're headed. And everybody that plays a part in not changing the game for the sake of changing the game, but really understanding the real risks and how to mitigate those, that's a good thing.
And I just want to bring it on to some more statistics of the recent Euros. Now, you've done research into us, Judith, and obviously Ben and I worked extensively through the summer last year, kind of analysing it, looking at the injuries, looking at all the data. But you found some really shocking statistics just to kind of solidify how often head injuries happen, because quite often people don't realise the frequency that they happen in top level football.
Yeah, and the stat that I'm going to just say in a moment is only what was seen. It was only what was recorded on video. So think what wasn't seen on video or by the human eye or by the observers or anybody watching the game. And the stat is that in 1.85 head impacts, head injuries per game in the Euros 2020 that was held in 2021, 1.85 head injuries. And, there were 73 times that games were stopped because of head injuries. And, players treated on the pitch, bandaged up. And we've seen that in the past Premier League season as well. But it's what happens afterwards, the unfolding of a concussion, the sub-concussion, not even aware of. And that's the scary thing about this. And, what will happen in this women's Euros? It'd be interesting to see the stats on that, given that we think that's a higher risk. What will happen in the World Cup coming up? What will happen in this future Premier League season and the season beyond? And what happens at the amateur clubs as well? And this is an issue hidden in plain sight. It's happening right around us in all sports at all levels, and getting people's awareness and knowledge to that, as uncomfortable as it is really key. And we're not just about talking about a problem, and there are a lot of people just talking about the problem. We're talking about the problem with a solution, with something that reduces that risk of rotational forces to the brain and reduces the risk of concussion and subconcussion injury. And I think that's really quite important. No one wants to talk about a problem when no one has a solution. And we'd welcome the opportunity to talk to clubs and to talk to players at all levels across all sports about how they can personally reduce their risk. And there are still so many players out there that haven't even been made aware of what CTE is, their risk factors, and actually what the difference is between a head injury and a brain injury. And the truth is, a head impact is a brain injury. And, I think that conversation is just long overdue, and anybody who contributes to it is doing a good thing.
Judith, do you think that needs to come from the highest level, from those governing bodies? Because as you touched upon, Euro 2020, as it was, we all seen video footage showed that Benjamin Pavard, France, loss of consciousness, assessed by the French medical team, allowed to continue. Protocols put in place by FIFA post-match say that players will be assessed independently around 24 to 72 hours after that game to deem their readiness or fitness to then feature in the next fixture. He was then cleared. We've seen that in the previous World Cup. Loss of consciousness, I think, was noted in Amrabat. Morocco allowed to continue. No problem in that return to play the next game, that quick turnaround. There's a lot of controversy with regards to that enhanced care setting protocol for concussion, a stage managed process where, within effectively that 7-day turnaround, you can return to play. A lot of people question that should be, extended way beyond that. But even within those international tournaments, players were back on the pitch within 3 to 4 days. Do you think it needs to be taken more seriously at that level for people, further down the tiers of football, down to grassroots, for them to understand and hopefully, appreciate the severity of what's happening and then to take action?
100%. So, I suppose that probably a good example of that is in rugby, where Steve Thompson has been talking about his CTE, his early onset dementia. He's been telling the story about, junior players at a local rugby club, taking more seriously, their concussion and not returning to play on the basis of Steve Thompson's story. And yes, there's the role of influencers, players in the game. There's the role of the governing bodies to really understand this. And most importantly, there's the individual. At the end of the day, it's your brain, and your brain defines you. It makes you who you are. It makes you the player you are. And I think, until the players start, or in instance of children, their parents start, I think that's where the change begins, where people start to say, hey, hold on a minute, this is my brain, this is my school career, this is my career, this is whatever, my professional game. I think it's a two-way thing. I think it's top down, bottom up. And I think that's going to make the change for people taking this seriously, making their own decision about whether they want to reduce their risk, protect themselves, and then what they do about it. But I think, the next 2, 3, maybe 5 years, I think the governing bodies will be under increasing pressure to really understand how significant this risk is and to be doing all they can to reduce it. And we've already seen that in game change rules, guidance, particularly around particular aspects of the game. But that's going to continue more and more, because more and more evidence is going to manifest around how significant concussions and subconcussions brain injury is in, not later in life, but in people from their 30s onwards, which was when CTE can start to manifest, and even younger. There've been examples in the US where younger players, amateur players, taken their own life, in their 20s, and when their brain has been examined, it's been found to have CTE in it, and that quite hasn't hit our shores yet. But once, advances around neuroimaging technology, etc., allow the brain to be better understood and better seen, and evidence of this detected, it really will bring it home. And as I say, it'll move it from that hidden in plain sight, which it is at the moment, to something that, there's as much time, effort, and risk mitigation given to it as there is around bad ankles, damaged knees, repaired, muscles, etc. And that's, again, just probably one of my final points is, again, that is where sport has to shift from thinking about performance below the neck. It's really quite nonsense when you understand that how significant the brain is in determining your performance.
Just on this issue then of governing bodies, and I've looked into the kind of politics side it's interesting that there's Commons committees now on concussion and things like that. But I'm sure, you're almost sad or a bit annoyed to see the slow progress. But in terms of maybe speeding that up, you've talked there of maybe a natural process where legalities and in terms of insurance might force these leagues, whether it be football, whether it be rugby or whatever other sport, might force the hand in that situation. But do you think that maybe the government needs to be proactive and step in and make some legislation so that sports bodies have to act within a certain time to protect individuals?
I think the government have a lot on their plate, and I think they've started, to look at concussion in sport. Obviously they didn't talk about subconcussion, which again is part of the issue about why they possibly didn't quite understand the scope of what this issue is. But it's not really for the government to legislate on this. It has to, if anybody's going to legislate on it and determine rules, it needs to come from the governing bodies. But one thing will make people sit up and wake up, and that's when the NHS has to pick up the price of brain injury. And, as more and more people start to understand the significance and the prevalence of brain injury in sport, it will ask the question, who's paying for this? And particularly in this country, it's the NHS will be paying for it. And will be much the same as when smokers, smokers pay their own way through the duty they pay on cigarettes. And people, I think, will be starting to ask, who are not in sport, why are we paying for sports injuries? And I think that's going to be an interesting debate and a tension between sport, governing bodies. Sport is perceived to be a very wealthy, a very commercial, multi-billion-dollar industry. And people are going to say, well, why should we pick up the tab? So I think that's going to be a real challenge. And that's where the government's going to be brought into this, because they're going to be brought into, well, actually, how can we, rightly and squarely push back the risks and the price that comes with that risk back to some of the governing bodies. And I think as well, the government may also ask sport to get its act together around the science and the data, so that actually the facts are really put out there and understood. I think that's something else the government will want to, I think, back to this quite confused debate. The government will probably push a little bit more on the bar around, well, what is the true picture around this and the true scale on this? But at the moment, this is not a government issue, and nor should it be. This is an issue that starts with governing bodies, and it starts with players in the game and those around the players, and I think top down and bottom up in sport. And then it becomes a wider societal issue. When people understand how significant CTE is, how devastating it is, then it becomes a societal issue.
And just on maybe rule changes that have happened, we did see last season the introduction of concussion substitutes. But once again, do you think that with the discussions about sub-concussion impacts and things like that, is this just kicking the kind of issue down the road? Because once again, it's after the event has happened. It's not preventative. It's not working on something that could stop even needing to have the concussion substitute.
Yeah, the concussion substitute, the heading guidance has all been focused around concussions, which again shows that not everybody quite understands the big picture here, because you talk about concussion and subconcussion. And yeah, it's back to this point, why are we talking about measuring and managing when, logically you talk about reducing? And then the measuring and management. There'll always be, even if every player was wearing brain protection, there's still a risk that you will have concussion and subconcussions, and there'll still be the need to measure and manage. Of course, there will be no brain protective product, not even ours, will stop it happening, but it will reduce it. And again, I think it's understanding this big picture. It's really appreciating the prevalence of what this is, and then the strategies that need to be implemented. And rushing to ban heading or reduce heading, or rushing to change number of red cards for tackles in rugby, these are all reactionary, because there is pressure to do something, to be seen to be doing something. The introduction of instrumented mouth guards, that's a data collection exercise. It takes the heat off the debate because, again, you're seen to be doing something. The question is, all of these things don't go back to what the logic would tell you. And the logic would tell you, rather than measuring and managing after the event, that you would seek to reduce it. And that's where we've landed in that space around developing brain protection.
And I guess one final question for me, I don't know if Ben has any as well, but let's imagine a utopia where Judith McMinn is now head of all sport in the UK. What is the kind of rule changes that you would bring in? Maybe a few point plan, kind of factoring it in, but you're the chief overlord of it all. What needs to be done over the coming years?
Well, back to this point about performance, what makes performance? And that is changing it from, starting with the brain and then everything else after that. Within reason, we could all be as fast and as fit and as strong as each other. We really could. If we had the right support around us and the right regimes around us, we probably could be that. But the brain makes us who we each are. So really, number one on my list would be redefining performance in sport to being the brain. And number two is then protecting that performance. And obviously that would be around wearing the Rezon product and reducing the risk of brain injury in sport. And number three would be around, everybody in sport making either a decision to buy in or not, but having to explain why you would not protect the brain. And that's, that would be my point. Not everybody will, as I say, want to protect their brain. Not everybody will appreciate that, but actually understanding and being able to think about why you are opting out of doing it, I think that would be hugely enlightening. And it would be enlightening at the most elite levels of sport, as well as, people who just try something for the first time. So those would be my three things, but it is around this whole notion of challenging, performance in sport from what we understand it today and what we've understood it to be for, thousands of years.
And Ben, is there anything else that you wanted to add to this already fantastic interview?
I think that's a great point to end this podcast on. I think it sums it up nicely. It shows you almost a roadmap of where we need to go. And I'd just like to thank you, Judith, for coming along and sharing your experiences, your knowledge, your wisdom, your insight. That's been fantastic and I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. I think this will be interesting because I think this is the start of a conversation around brain injury and, injury analysis. That's going to start and going to become more and more prevalent, more and more vocal, and more analysed, over the coming seasons in every sport. And I think I'll watch with great interest what happens in the next season and beyond.
And I guess the final thing, to have those conversations, people need to know where you are, your information, and the amazing research that you've done as well. So what is kind of maybe your social medias, your website, just so that people know where to go?
Well, we're a County Durham-based company. We manufacture in Sheffield, and rezonwear.com, rezonwear.com is our website. Rezonwear is our social media handles on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. And one thing I think it's worth saying is the firm is called Rezon, and there's a very good reason to protect your brain. So that's easy to remember in terms of name.